Hello, and welcome to Cahnmanns Current Events Roundtable. And our show is brought to you in part by the Bluegrass Restaurant in Highland Park. And I want to thank my wonderful director, Larry Beyer, for always doing a great job, and for my wonderful crew, Herb Walenka, Ron Levitsky, and Julian Martinson. And again, thank them, for their always being there to direct this show. I want to thank them again. And I want to welcome back a wonderful guest, James Williams. Hello, James.
Hello, thank you.
And James Williams is coming today to talk on the topic of autism awareness across America. And James has been here before talking about autism in the North Shore area, in Highland Park, Illinois, and Deerfield, Illinois, Northbrook, Illinois, the North Shore. But today he's going to be talking about autism awareness across America. But before we talk to James, I want to read something that I think is important for our viewers to understand a little bit about autism. Over the past 30 years, autism spectrum disorder has gone from a rare and obscure medical curiosity to a common development disorder affecting millions of American children. Conventional medical and psychiatric treatments are limited to therapy and a handful of minimally effective drugs. 35% of young children with ASD are unable to work and are dependent on family or public services for survival. The average American gives this problem very little attention until it enters their lives through an affected family member. And that is so true. I mean, I didn't even know, James, too much about autism until my cousin's daughter had autism, and I also knew of another case that a friend of ours whose son has autism, but I didn't know too much about it until, as they say, until it affects somebody a family member, a family friend, a relative, and then you really start understanding and learning about it. And that's why I brought you to the show, because last time, again, we featured on the show, you talked about your experience growing up with autism in the North Shore. However, you have been traveling around the United States, giving presentations on autism awareness for over a decade. How does life with autism differ in other parts of America versus, say, the North Shore, the things that, I figured everything's the same, but apparently it isn't.
Absolutely. No, in fact, the experiences of people with autism are very different in different parts of America. And one thing that I think is important for our viewers to remember is that although autism, like most other disabilities, has a definite list of symptoms, and autism, there are other disabilities that also fall on a spectrum too. Autism is not the only disability that falls on a spectrum. Autism is by definition a social disability. And as a result, the social culture, the community, the values of any given area are going to take a big part in how people with autism in that area are treated and understood. In addition, as you mentioned in the article, a lot of people with autism, they're very reliant on public services. Public services are often funded and governed by individual states, even if the federal government has some influence in terms of funding. However, regardless of federal regulations, all states have different services they offer individuals with autism, and because of the cultural differences of each state, treat their residents with autism differently. Therefore, the experiences of a person with autism can often be very different based on the state you live in and your community.
Maybe you could explain that a little bit, James. How is it different, say, Illinois versus California, Florida, New York? Give us an idea of how it differs in different states.
Exactly. Well, before I do that, I will answer the first question about how autism differs in parts of America versus the North Shore.
Okay.
And that's kind of like a segue, because the North Shore tends to be economically a more affluent place than even other parts of the Chicago area. And one of the things that shapes, in many cases, the experience of a person with autism in the North Shore is that people here grow up feeling like they're entitled to certain things. Access to a good college after they finish high school, a good car when they get a driver's license, and then a good job in adulthood. And when you have autism, oftentimes those life expectations aren't always available to you. Many people with autism are not eligible to get driver's licenses. And even though some of them do go to college, they don't always get that good job after they finish college. But here in the North Shore, where economically many of those things are available to many people, there's kind of a sense that, you know, why aren't you reaping the benefits of these things that you are entitled to growing up here? Whereas in other communities that are not so affluent, where it's common for people to not have the financial means to go to a good college, to get a fancy car when they get a driver's license, people with autism might also find themselves unable to do those things, but there's less of a sentiment of, why aren't you reaping the benefits? Because many people economically are also having similar struggles. So there's that big gap here in the North Shore where I, because of my autism, couldn't reap those benefits because of my disability that others were, whereas in other parts of the country that are not as affluent, there's not as much of a gap between economic ability and ability due to a disability.
Yeah, so you have to take mostly taxis or Ubers or Lyfts or, you know, to get to your places, correct? And
Absolutely.
And other people with autism, depending on type of autism that they have, can drive, and others also cannot drive. You know, so there's people that with autism that can drive, and some aren't able to drive. Or is their license also limited to maybe daytime over evening as well?
Well, driving is not a universal deficiency with autism, as you mentioned. Some people with autism have conditional licenses. Some people don't. What is mostly universal with autism is not whether or not a person can drive. It's really the fact that most people with autism, by definition, have social impairments. They do not have many of the core social abilities that non-autistic people have. And so, depending on what the social norms are in a different state or a culture, those deficits are going to play out very differently. In addition, states also differ based on what laws they expect people, what are the requirements. So I can give you an example. Here in Illinois, and this is an Illinois thing, not a North Shore thing, Illinois law requires that public schools have some of the most stringent, some of the highest, most stringent physical education expectations. As a consequence of that, many children with autism in Illinois public schools are injured in physical education class because they don't have the strength and stamina to meet these standards that the Illinois legislature has decided should be within the ability of children. For example, under Illinois law, freshmen are expected to run a mile as part of the examination for physical education. Many children with autism and other disabilities cannot run that mile. Yet the states decided legally all children have to be able to complete that mile run in ninth
Or can
grade.
they get a doctor's certificate or, you know, that stating that they aren't able to do that particular physical education? They could do something, maybe a written exam or something else on physical education, because I know a lot of children that have autism, physically they don't have the movement, because we have some family members that, you know, are awkward running. They cannot, they cannot move their legs in the same manner as a child that does not have autism. So it would be very hard for them to complete that mile. I mean, they may maybe it would take them an hour and a half to someone that would make that mile in 10 minutes. So is there any kind of where they can take some kind of maybe a paper exam or something that they have to watch on television or something and complete a different type of physical, you know, where they can, like I remember some of us had to take the Constitution test, some of us had to, to graduate, and others were able to take a course on the Constitution. There was, so I was just wondering, what do they have that they can possibly not do, but has to do something else in its place?
Well, Illinois law does allow physical education to be waived if there is a doctor's notice. And in fact, when I went to high school growing up here, I had many friends who did get those doctor's exemptions. However, the point I'm making, though, is that that's a law in Illinois that does not exist in many other states. In fact, Illinois is the only state that requires its students in public school to take physical education all 4 years of high school. The vast majority of other states do not require physical education past the freshman or sophomore year of high school, but other states have different requirements. So 1,000 miles to the south of Illinois is the state of Florida. Most people, when they think of Florida, they think, oh, here's a state I'm going to visit for Disney World or a resort. But Florida, while Florida does not have the same physical education requirements as Illinois, that state, for many years, had a law called the FCAT requirement. And the FCAT was a state standardized requirement that sanctioned whether or not you were going to finish high school. And as a consequence of that law, smart, intelligent high school kids in the state of Florida who got good grades with autism were denied the ability to get a high school diploma because they could not pass that test.
Now, can they do that now? Was that law changed?
The law was changed, but it was replaced with another test that is still stopping those individuals from finishing high school.
When you see things like this going on in states and you travel, do you talk to any of the legislatures or anybody that you feel that can possibly help change that law? Do you make it known to the families that they can help change that law? If you see unfairness on autistic children?
I can tell you right now, I don't have a lot of access to legislators. What I do, however, have is access to people that have that access.
Okay.
So, I give a lot of presentations in Florida and have worked in Florida for many years. And I work with people who do have that legislative influence. Mm-hmm. And learning from them about how many high school students with autism were being denied high school diplomas that had good grades because they could not pass the FCAT graduation test made me say to them, I may not have the power that you have to try to legislate change, but I fully support your efforts in overturning, or if not overturning that law, amending it so that exceptions can be made for those students with autism. Because for many years, that law also stipulated that since this is a state requirement, the state cannot make changes. And that law denied so many people with not just autism, but other disabilities, a high school diploma, that whole classrooms were built in Florida schools that were basically self-contained classrooms, all for children who had been predicted by the schools were not going to finish high school.
I think some of us, I'm a psychologist, and I used to have patients with severe anxiety disorders and couldn't take timed tests. Otherwise they would fail because they would just be sitting there and everybody would turn in their work and they would just be on question number 2. And I would make sure that these children would be able to take the test outside of the classroom, maybe in the school library by themselves with a librarian present or somebody present, but only one person, and it wasn't timed. You can't imagine. These kids that failed immediately in a time test would fail and get zeros on their paper, would be the highest scorers of the room, just being able to take the test without being timed, and they were able to do it perfectly because their anxiety was so severe that they couldn't, they couldn't manage with other people getting up and turning their papers in. And so things like this need to be done, similar things for autistic children, because most of them are very, very bright.
They are.
They just communicate differently.
They not only communicate differently, but they have a personality and a functionality that often is viewed very offensively towards many people. And probably one classic example in Hollywood of this demonstration is a classic scene in an old Matthew Broderick movie called War Games. And in this movie, the main character, Matthew Broderick, is a high school kid who's also a computer hacker, and he wants to be able to break into a computer system. And so he goes to this place where his friends who are hackers are doing something, and one of them is very bright, but he's very, very offensive. And he offends everybody with his rude mannerisms, but at the end of this scene, after the polite hackers don't have the answer for the Matthew Broderick character, the rude one chimes in, gives the exact answer that the Matthew Broderick character needs, even though he was rude and offended everyone in that scene.
And some of the rudeness, because I have on high-functioning autism, many of the autistic children, sometimes we talked about lacking social cues. They have difficulty with social cues. And also there's difficulty with eye contact, understanding personal boundaries. And I know when they're interested, they give it 100, even 150%. Some of them may act a little bit more aggressive and rude and having difficulty maybe empathizing, but it's the way they are. They have a sensory overload, and it kind of overwhelms them at times. And so people that, a lot of people don't realize that there is a member of my family that isn't he's high functioning autistic. And there are people that, may not want to go out with him because possibly he doesn't show attention. He's looking on his phone, and he doesn't seem to show, any social techniques that most people do. When you go out to dinner with somebody, you don't look at your phone or look at your iPad. You give eye contact and speak. But a lot of people don't know that he is high-functioning autistic. And so, these people are very bright, but the social techniques, their social cues for some reason aren't there. Maybe you could explain a little bit what are social cues, and maybe so people, our viewers can understand that.
Well, one of the things that is very visible when people first interact with people with autism is that a lot of social norms that most non-autistic people just naturally do. They do it habitually without even thinking about it, are not instinctive to people with autism. And that's part of one of the major issues people with autism have, that these social expectations, many of which are unwritten, unspoken, that people just do, that are often necessary to maintain relationships with people, are not natural for many people with autism. And that's a common issue that appears all across America, even if the norms that people with autism are struggling to understand are not the same. And one of the reasons why that is because when you have autism, you perceive the world differently. Things that make non-autistic people happy might make you very offended or upset, and vice versa. And one thing I've realized, and this is actually something that I concluded after an amazing example taught at a lecture at an autism conference for teachers in Columbus, Ohio, what this teacher did was, the speaker did was, she showed to an audience mostly of teachers a picture of a man walking in a blizzard without a coat on. And she said to the teachers, okay, what is this man feeling? And obviously people responded, cold. And the speaker said, okay, why do you perceive him to be cold? You don't know how he's feeling. You're not in his body. Mm-hmm. What you're really saying is that you perceive this man to be cold because you yourself would feel cold if you were outside in a blizzard without a coat on. You can't actually know, though, if this man is cold. And that's when, although I had hypothesized this for many years, the person with autism, I felt as if something I had gone through much of my life was confirmed by that speaker. Because what she basically was saying is that for most non-autistic people, there is a shared perception of the social world. So they instinctively know what's appropriate, what isn't, what's rude and offensive, because if somebody acted a certain way towards them, they'd feel offended. And usually what would make most non-autistic people offended is the same. But when you have autism and you're not feeling offended by things that offend other people, and you're not feeling happy with things that make other people happy.
Now, how do you get them into the conversation? Maybe to know something that is interesting to them.
So this is something that's, I'm not trying to be offensive, but this is something that you can't just explain in a quick soundbite.
Right.
So what's happening here is that your brain is not perceiving the rudeness, and part of your autism also is you have a hard time understanding how people perceive things differently. So oftentimes the interest mechanism emerges because when you've lived so much of your life offending people, and people often being upset at you for things that you instinctively didn't know were offensive, you often become scared of communicating. It's like the old saying that Walt Disney immortalized in Bambi: if you can't say something nice, don't say something at all. And for many people with autism, they really can't say something nice, but they are in situations where they're expected to say something, but they'd rather not say anything at all.
So they clam up.
But when they are interested in something, suddenly everything changes. They know what to say related to their interest. And as a result, they will go 100% whatever, because suddenly now they know their interest. But many other small talk conversations where they don't know what to say and they've offended people, trying to engage in small talk.
So small talk is very hard for
very hard.
autistic people because they don't seem to understand small talk. What is it, small talk being the hi, how are you? It was nice seeing you the other day, it'd be nice to see you again, that type of, is that what when you say small talk?
Exactly.
Like that.
And see and in that kind of, and small talk is a perfect way of reinforcing the point I made earlier, that non-autistic people often have a strong need to engage in small talk and pleasantries before getting into a subject. It's kind of a way of, reinforcing the relationship, whether it's a friendship or whatever you have with a person. But when you have autism, you're very much more of a cut-to-the-chase, literal person. So the idea that you would need to have gratuitous small talk at times doesn't mean anything to you. So now, for people with autism, since they don't have that need for small talk, it's hard for them to
understand that
others do. Yeah,
especially like, they say that you had them over for dinner and they're about to leave, it's time to leave, and most people, before they leave, they have small talk again. Oh, it's nice being here, thank you for the dinner, and they stay around. But a person with autism, a lot of times they'll say, they just get up, we're going, boom, and they're leaving. They put their coat on because we talked about we're going to leave, but that doesn't mean we're going to leave in maybe 5-10 minutes. But if they hear they're going to leave, they immediately put their coat on and leave.
Absolutely.
And they don't even say thank you. They don't get into the small talk. They leave. It's done.
And so what you have to keep in mind here is that, non-autistic people engaging in small talk mutually often will have the need for small talk. And so here you have this social system based on non-autistic needs that is difficult when you have autism. You don't have those needs, and you often have to cater to something that isn't yours. But at the same time, too, what also is hindering you is that you don't have as much social brain power as others as well. Thus, for many people with autism, because they're constantly having to basically do all these things that they don't have a need for, then comes to their reasoning, what's the return on this social investment? If I'm going to bust my mental butt, metaphorically, if I'm going to work mentally so hard to fit in with you, what am I going to get in return? And many times when you're a child with autism, your parents make you engage in activities that you don't feel like there's a return on. But in adulthood, when you have more control over your life, what often enables people with autism to be social is if they feel like they're getting an emotional return or whatever return, like having a friendship they value or getting something that they value at their work, they will then go the extra mile if they feel like they're getting a return on this intense social investment they have to engage in to function.
And so across America, is this some of the things that you do talk about to help other people understand people with autism, families, friends, parents, brothers, sisters, whoever, understand a little bit more about the needs of an autistic person and why they respond the way they do?
Exactly. And as today's interview comes towards a close, the point that I think the takeaway of this interview is that whether or not you live in the North Shore or another part of America, the rules and the services and the social laws may be very different, but there are principles of autism that are still the same. No matter where I travel in America, people with autism still struggle with many of the social norms and expectations of their communities. Wherever I travel in America, the laws may be different, but there are still many laws, whether they're laws in schools, laws regarding services that people with autism struggle with. The struggle is the struggles in specific are different, but there is still the same principle of rules and regulations across America that just really don't work for many people with autism.
And do you find that, is there somebody that, with the last few minutes, are there anybody that helps people with autism to understand some of the socialization techniques and to handle this with them, that help them learn some of these, with our last 2 minutes that we have left? What can be done for these people?
Well, everywhere I go, there are people who work hard to help those people. But the most important thing is just know how those rules are different. Know that while people with autism, whether they're in the North Shore, they're in Florida, they're in Ohio, they're going to have those struggles even if the rules are different. I will close with an observation I learned when I was in high school myself, taking child development. My child development teacher very openly said an amazing lesson about the work of the psychologist Robert Havighurst. Havighurst was a man who traveled all over the world, and what he found is that every culture had different social and developmental expectations for their members, and although the expectations were different everywhere he traveled, there were people in every culture who, because of some disability or something, failed to meet those expectations, and so every culture had some concept of a disability. So I will close by saying, no matter where you are in America, the principle of the struggle is the same, even if the details are different. And in knowing that, my hope is that we can all learn from those different struggles and acknowledge those similarities more than the differences.
That's very good, James. And I think people need to know this. And when you meet somebody or you know somebody with autism, try to understand where they're coming from too. Maybe not to expect them to meet your expectations. And I think that's really important because we can't always meet each other's expectations, but maybe learning about we're all different, we're not all the same. And even for that moment, the power of being different is here's a very picture of who is that?
Albert Einstein.
And Albert Einstein was different. He didn't do that well in school, but I mean, this guy is brilliant. The power of being different, and we all are different, and that's very important. And we need to empathize with people that don't have the same thing as we do. We're not all the same. We're not cookie cutter, and we have to be open to differences. And I think autism, there is differences, and I think we need to begin to understand what they are. And I'm really glad that we're having this show today.